Welcome to Washington Today on C-SPAN Radio for Thursday, October 27th, 2022. A dozen days until Election Day. We'll look at some of the issues that both parties are leaning on heavily to try to help them win over voters. For the Democrats, abortion. Candidates in New Hampshire's Senate race disagreeing on that today. And for Republicans, fighting crime. We'll hear from candidates running for U.S. Senator from Wisconsin and talk about it with a reporter from U.S. News & World Report. Economy and inflation often ranked the number one issue in voters' minds. A new government report today showing U.S. gross domestic product, or GDP, grew by a 2.6% annualized rate between July and September. This after negative growth in the first half of the year. President Joe Biden trumpeting that news as he visits Syracuse, New York, to talk about a company's investment in computer chip manufacturing in the billions of dollars. At the Pentagon, Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin releasing the unclassified version of the National Defense Strategy. It says that China is the U.S.'s leading pacing challenge and calls Russia an acute threat. Secretary Austin also responding to Russian President Vladimir Putin, saying today, "We have never said anything about the possible use of nuclear weapons by Russia, but only hinted at the statements made by the leaders of Western countries." There are 35 U.S. Senate races this year, but a handful are being closely watched because the polls are so close there that they'll likely decide which party gets a majority, now the Senate being divided 50-50. The races included those in Pennsylvania, Georgia, Nevada, Arizona, Wisconsin, and New Hampshire. In New Hampshire, Senator Maggie Hassan, Democrat, running for re-election today, debating Republican challenger Don Bolduc, a retired Army general. It was hosted by New Hampshire Public Radio and Public Television. NPR, National Public Radio, has an article on the New Hampshire contest that reads, "Many voters across the political spectrum say rising costs on home heating, groceries, gas, and housing are a top issue, but access to abortion is animating the Democratic base and a sizable chunk of independents, over 40% of the state's electorate, who warn that flipping a blue seat red in the midterms could lead to a Republican-controlled Senate that decides to take up legislation to institute a federal abortion ban." Here's part of today's debate on abortion.
And right now we're going to move to another question for you, General Bullock, regarding abortion. You say you oppose a federal abortion ban at a federal level. You said that consistently since the primary. But in Portsmouth recently, you said, quote, "These other things, we've got to look into them." You were fielding a question related to in vitro fertilization. What other things were you referring to?
Well, I have no idea because I don't have reference to that. But bottom line is, and ma'am, I wish you would please listen to me because I can read your mask. I do not support a federal ban, either for or against abortion at the federal level. It is now a state issue, which she does not understand. I support New Hampshire's law. I support Granite Staters. She lies. I've told her this personally in several venues, and she continues to lie. Her commercials are hurtful. Her commercial about me wanting to murder mothers is disgraceful. It's disgraceful, and it brought my 8-year-old granddaughter to tears. I have worked my entire life to protect men and women and children, my entire life, and I will never, ever put anyone's life in jeopardy. These accusations are hurtful. She talks about working with people. She talks about wanting to get out there on the ground. Well, I've been out there on the ground. I know what these ads do. I know what these lies do. Lying about Social Security, lying about everything.
We're talking about abortion right now. We're going to move to Senator Hassan in a moment. I've got one.
No ban. Support the state law. I will always do that.
So no role for the federal government on any issue touching.
No. And I've told Mitch McConnell and I've told Lindsey Graham.
Okay, Senator, you argue abortion should be a private decision between a woman and her doctor. Do you see any role for the federal government to play in regulating abortion, or should this be a state matter?
Let's just take a step back for a minute because there's been a lot said over the last couple of minutes about a huge number of issues. But let me talk about abortion, and then I hope to have the opportunity to talk about a couple of the other things that Don Bolduc is frankly misleading people about. This is about a woman's fundamental freedom, her health, and her safety. And Don Bolduc has a very long record of extremism here. He said on the campaign trail that he would never vote against anti-choice legislation in the United States Senate. That means he is a yes vote for a national abortion ban. And people can go to BolducFacts.com and see the videos of Don Bolduc saying these things. He said that we should rejoice when Dobbs overturned Roe v. Wade. The women of New Hampshire are not rejoicing. And when we have pushed him on this, first he told the women of New Hampshire to get over it. Then he said that gentlemen in the state legislature should make these decisions for us. The problem with politicians like Don Bolduc drawing arbitrary lines, I'm getting to your question for just a second, arbitrary lines in terms of these decisions is that they can in fact harm women and cost them their lives in some cases.
But so do you believe, though, that the government should play any role in the regulation of abortion, period?
I believe that when the government tries to do that, it can cost women their lives, as we have seen in some states. And I think it is very, very concerning that people don't trust women and their doctors to make these very complex and often tragic decisions together.
But you were one of the sponsors of the Women's Health Protection Act, which leaves the door open for states to limit abortion after viability. So you see that as something that states should be able to do?
I am a sponsor of that law. I support that law. It would be my preference that neither legislators in the United States Senate nor in state legislatures substitute their judgment in complex, difficult decisions for women and their doctors. I also think it's really important that we allow doctors to do their jobs without fear of criminal prosecution.
New Hampshire Senator Maggie Hassan, Democrat, debating Republican challenger Don Bolduc today. The nonpartisan Cook Political Report with Amy Walter rates this race as leans Democratic. One of the Senate races that the Cook Political Report calls a toss-up is in Wisconsin. Incumbent Republican Ron Johnson is facing Democrat Mandela Barnes, the current lieutenant governor. Senator Johnson has been making fighting crime a key part of his message to voters. Here's a part of an exchange between the candidates at the debate in Milwaukee from October 13th.
One thing you have to do is you have to keep violent criminals in jail, and you have to support law enforcement. Now, unfortunately, we have an administration in Wisconsin right now that their goal was to reduce the prison population by 50%. They reduced it 15%, including paroling 884 criminals. 784 were violent, including 44 child rapists, 270 criminals who either committed or at least attempted murder. So keep violent criminals in jail. One of the things you use is cash bail, and there's an effort here to eliminate cash bail, but also we have to support law enforcement. You don't go on Russian Today TV and denounce law enforcement.
So let me follow up on that, because you're talking about a state issue here with the parole system, and yes. Under Republican governors and under Democratic governors, offenders have been released under the old parole system. You also supported in the Senate the first step, which allowed federal prisoners to be released or earn the option of early release. So do you not think people should have the option to be released early under the system of parole?
Sure. And my Joseph Project offers a second chance by providing formerly incarcerated individuals opportunities to turn their life around. So we all believe in redemption. I primarily supported the First Step Act because it eliminated the disparity between crack and powder cocaine. Mm-hmm. I had a real concern, and that's why we asked for strict monitoring of who would be released to see if people commit further crimes. But what the Evers-Barnes administration did is they let people out on bail that horrific crimes.
Mr. Barnes.
Exactly. So it feels like the senator is trying to walk away from his record. Once again, he is bemoaning me for, the acts of the administration. But at the same time, the First Step Act released 2,000 to 3,000 people on parole early. So do you walk away from that? Do you not claim credit for that, for the release of 2,000 to 3,000 people, while at the same time attacking me for it?
You can respond if you want.
Again,
I know you referred to it already. Please, audience, if the audience could please hold on.
What I've seen are the violent criminals your administration released. I had concern about releasing, and we should be getting a report in terms of who was released, but we were told it was going to be very non-violent, people who have completely rehabilitated themselves. That's not who released here in Wisconsin. This
is the hypocrisy. He is attacking me for the same thing that he is doing.
Wisconsin Senate debate between Mandela Barnes, Democrat, and Ron Johnson, Republican, in Milwaukee on October 13th from WTMJ TV. An article by Susan Milligan, senior political writer for U.S. News and World Report, begins. Crime and its cousin policing have become central issues in the 2022 midterms, but the approach by candidates and responses by voters have flipped back and forth with events, leaving unclear who the electoral beneficiaries will be. Susan Milligan now joining us by phone. Thank you so much. Why is it unclear?
Well, because as events have unfolded over this entire election cycle, actually, attention has gone one way or the other. So if you look earlier in the cycle where, people were very upset about allegations of police abuse and violence, then it was sort of maybe favoring Democrats in a way who are galvanizing their voters. But then as crime has risen in certain areas, then that has given the Republicans an opportunity to galvanize their voters, and also to there's something sort of more nuanced there, just making voters feel uncertain and unsafe. And it's an interesting thing about crime. People's perceptions, and this has been true for decades, it's not just true this year, people's perceptions of crime are not generally in sync with what's actually happening. Even when we had a massive decrease in crime in the 90s and a little bit beyond, when pollsters would ask people, they thought that crime was going up, and it wasn't. And the thing is what's happening now, for example, when you look at New York City crime is starting, or homicides have come down a little bit, but because the crimes that you hear about are just so awful and so random, like people getting pushed into the subway tracks or something like that, it has a very unsettling effect on voters. And the thing is, because it's New York and everybody hears about it, it ends up having an unsettling effect on voters who don't live anywhere near New York.
Are the issues of crime and policing used by candidates more to motivate their base or to try to persuade independents and undecideds?
I would say in the case of concerns about police brutality and sort of inequity in criminal justice, that's more about motivating the base on the Democratic side. On the Republican side, it motivates the base, but it also is an effort to reach out to suburban voters and independent voters. And again, even if the crime isn't happening in their neighborhood, there's sort of this sense of it's coming to get you. There's also a racial undertone to this as well. If you look at some of the ads that are being run in some states, Wisconsin, for example, the criminals in the ads are almost always black. And if there's a black candidate, in a couple cases, they appear darker than they actually are in the ads. So there's this kind of undertone of you're in your safe community, but these horrible criminals are coming to get you. So it's kind of both, but I think directed also at suburban voters. And, it ends up kind of getting linked with other things. For example, inflation gives people a sense of being insecure, uncertain. And when you put these two things together, sort of not feeling safe in your finances, maybe not feeling safe in your home, it has, I think, kind of an exponential effect.
We're talking with Susan Milligan from U.S. News and World Report. When you have seen crime and policing used, is it in generalities or are the candidates actually proposing solutions?
Well, that's an interesting thing, and it's kind of unfortunate because there were solutions being proposed after George Floyd's, well, now we can say murder because someone was convicted of the murder, where you had Cory Booker and Tim Scott, a Democrat and Republican in the Senate, working on legislation together to address this, and then unfortunately it fell apart. I mean, that was one of the few things where it was a genuine, intellectual, mutual push for legislation in the Senate, and it didn't fall apart. But again, it's the kind of thing where, emotions were very high, particularly among black voters then, just watching what was happening in so many cities around the country, and still happens. I mean, there's still stories about that in the news. But yeah, as we get closer to an election, you're just much less likely to see a bipartisan effort on something where one side or the other or both are using it as a political issue.
And finally, as you referred to sometimes as a racial component, I was thinking, does crime and policing become a proxy for other issues, perhaps on the Republican side for immigration and on the Democratic side for equity and justice?
I think that's absolutely true. I mean, for the Democrats, definitely equity and justice, because if you're a black man and you're worried about being stopped by police when you're just going to the grocery store and you don't know what's going to happen to you, that's actually about more than just feeling safe from police. It's about just your standing in society as a black man or as a black person. And then with Republicans, I mean, look, the whole idea, yes, immigration, because you hear stories about a crime that occurred and it was someone who was here illegally, and so then that becomes an issue for them of why was this person here anyway? But it's, again, the racial thing is there. I mean, it goes all the way back to Willie Horton, in the campaign against Michael Dukakis, and showing this black inmate who was let out on a Massachusetts program for sort of a weekend furlough and then committed a crime. And you're just seeing a repeat of that now. And it seems to be working. It's working in Wisconsin, even in New York State, where I don't think Kathy Hochul, the Democratic governor, is really too endangered. It's a pretty Democratic state. But her Republican opponent, Lee Zeldin, has been just hammering away crime. In the debate the other night, basically every question he was asked, he answered. He pivoted to crime. And it's helped him really start to close the gap with her.
Susan Milligan is a senior political writer for U.S. News and World Report. Find her stories at usnews.com, and on Twitter it's at @MilliganSusan. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
As Republicans seek to pick up enough seats in the U.S. House of Representatives to get a majority, they need less than 10. One on the radar is Alaska's at-large congressional district. The incumbent is a Democrat, Mary Peltola, who won a special election earlier this year to replace the late Congressman Don Young, a Republican who held the seat for 50 years. Alaska is also a state that Donald Trump won in the 2020 presidential election by 10 points. On Wednesday night, Congresswoman Peltola debated three challengers in Anchorage: Nick Begich, a Republican businessman; Sarah Palin, Republican, former governor and former U.S. vice presidential nominee; and Chris Bai, Libertarian and listed as a fishing guide. A question to all of them about bipartisanship.
How much of a threat is political division to American democracy? And if you think it is a threat, what can Congress do to address it? For this question, you will have 1 minute to respond. Mr. Bai, you'll be first.
It's absolutely a travesty. And unfortunately, both the parties are on the same team. I mean, you've got the Republicans over here and you've got the Democrats over here, and in the middle, they're swinging a wrecking ball back and forth, back and forth. And down here below is people like me, people who are just normal Alaskans, and we get pulled in one direction by one bully, and that Republican drops the wrecking ball, and it goes through and it smashes us, and then it goes up to the next side, and the Democrats they increase it and they smash back through, and at the end, all we do is lose freedoms and liberties. That's why I'm running, because I'm tired of both political parties ruining it for us. I mean, the evidence is clear. You can't trust either one of them. $31 trillion of debt, the Patriot Act now, the Freedom Act, there's no freedom in it. And it's frustrating. And I represent the 70% of Alaskans that didn't vote because, frankly, neither party put candidates that relate to them. We're trying. That's all we can do, right? We can try to make it better.
Ms. Balin, 1 minute, please.
I'm the one candidate up here with experience, especially in an administrative role, that has had to reach across party lines in order to get things done for those whom I served. Local level, city council, mayor, those are nonpartisan positions. You learn to put partisanship away, and the goal is to serve the people. It's really quite simple. On a federal level, it's really quite simple. You follow the Constitution. We need common sense, which is an endangered species in D.C. nowadays. We need common sense, constitutional conservatives elected who have that experience or at least the wherewithal to work with others as a team. Now, Lincoln had said, President Lincoln, he had said, no foreign power will ever crush America. They have no chance against us, especially against our military. However, we should be cognizant of this. We would be crushed from within if the division gets any more rancorous. If it gets any worse than it is, we need to protect our foundation.
Thank you. Representative Peltola, you have 1 minute.
Thank you. I do believe that partisanship is the #1 threat to our country, both in terms of foreign policy and domestic policy. We've got formidable enemies now. We've got Russian and Chinese ships in formation, practicing outside of Alaska and in our waters. The list goes on in terms of new foreign aggression. I really feel like I'm back in the Cold War again, and worse. We've got domestic policies, like domestic issues like we haven't seen in 40 years that we really need to coalesce and work together on. I think that we have a tradition now in America of tearing one another down just to get into office, and this is just so normal. We take it for granted. When I was coming up in politics in the 90s, this was not par for the course. This is not the foundation that our country is built on, and we need more peacemakers so that the day after the election, half the country doesn't feel like they lost. We are all going to win. We're all in this together. We're all Americans.
Mr. Begich, 1 minute, please.
Well, I think that sounds great, but I think the reality is that you've got two very different visions for this country. You've got the Democrats who are about control of your freedoms, control of your actions, centralized authority, the federal government telling you what to do. And you've got the Republicans that are about decentralized control, local control with the states, and giving you the authority to make the decisions that you want to in your life. This is the basis, this is the genesis for the political division that you see. The political division is an emergent property, is an outgrowth of these very different base philosophies that we are in a very robust conversation in this country. We're having this conversation on social media, on mainstream media, on alternative media, over the dinner table. And it's good to have these discussions. It's good to have these discussions. It's part of our freedom of speech, and we need to exercise that speech, and I'm a full supporter of it.
Republican Nick Begich debate for the member of the U.S. Congress from Alaska. There's only one representing the entire state. It's at large. Of the three candidates, Republican Sarah Palin, Libertarian Chris By, and the incumbent is Democrat Mary Peltola. Sponsored this debate, Alaska Public Media, Alaska News Source, and KTOO. Why 4 candidates and 2 Republicans? Because Alaska's using a ranked choice voting system. Voters rank their preferences 1 through 4. If no candidate gets over 50% of first-place votes, the candidate with the fewest votes gets eliminated, and then voters who voted for that candidate have their second-place votes count, and then you tally it up again, and so on until there is a winner. U.S. House of Representatives Press Gallery website has a page it calls the casualty list, members who have or will be leaving office due to death, resignation, seeking other office, losing a re-election primary, or retirement. On the list, as of the end of September, 45 Democrats and 37 Republicans out of the 435 voting members. Today, 2 Democrats who are retiring, Sherry Bustos of Illinois, Kathleen Rice of New York, joining a former Republican member who retired some years back, Ileana Ross-Layton of Florida. The moderator, Politico reporter Elena Schneider. You're going to hear a question from Ms. Schneider and then an answer from Congresswoman Kathleen Rice.
As 3 women who clearly have relationships with each other, have relationships with women across the aisle, what does it mean that you all don't want to keep doing this? And does it worry you about who might come in to replace you? I mean, is that the sort of stuff that keeps you up at night?
Well, if I could just say real quickly, I think that there over the past, the past couple of election cycles, it seems that there are more and more people who want to run and come to Washington as performance artists as opposed to serious legislators. It's how many Twitter followers they have, how much money they can make for their campaigns, and they really don't add anything to the legislative conversation. But look, that's where we are. Social media has overtaken our lives. It is where most people communicate with their followers and their constituents. And it would be nice for us to just kind of remember that we go, that being in Washington really is a privilege. And, it would be better if people felt the need to, or had the moral courage to, compromise and not see that as a 4-letter word, because that's what has happened. And, it's unfortunate that the last few bills, although they were bipartisan when they came out of the Senate, were basically, somewhat bipartisan in the House, but these are bills that were meant to help, Americans all across the country. And it would have been nice for us to kind of get together. I thought, wow, if a pandemic doesn't bring the Democratic and Republican Party together, what the heck will? So I hope that people who are coming to Washington take this job more seriously and understand that the job is really in Washington to make, reach across the aisle and get things done and not just worry about how many Twitter followers you have.
Congresswoman Kathleen Rice, Democrat from New York, retiring after 4 terms on a panel hosted by Politico with Congresswoman Shuri Bustos of Illinois, also Democrat, retiring after 5 terms, and former Congresswoman Ileana Ros-Lehtinen, Republican from Florida, who retired in 2019 after 10 terms. You can find the full discussion with them archived at cspan.org, our video library. The news site Syracuse.com reports that President Joe Biden, who lived in Syracuse as a law student in the 1960s, will return to the city today to highlight Micron Technology Inc.'s plan to build a $100 billion semiconductor plant in nearby Clay. The visit, the president's first since becoming president last year, is a chance for him to take a victory lap over his efforts to bring semiconductor manufacturing back to the U.S. That's from Syracuse.com. President today also noting the Commerce Department's report that the U.S. economy grew in the third quarter of the year at an annualized rate of 2.6% after 2 consecutive quarters of negative growth.
When I took office, the economy was in ruins. My predecessor was the first president since Herbert Hoover, not a joke, to lose jobs in the entirety of his administration, the first. Unemployment when I was sworn in was at 6.4%. Hundreds of thousands of small businesses closed. The irony is that during the pandemic, the record number of Americans became, at the same time we lost all these small companies, a record number of Americans became billionaires in the middle of this crisis. While more than 9 million people were still out of work from the pandemic when I took office. Today, with the help of the people behind me, we're in a much better place. 10 million jobs created since we took office, a record for any administration in American history. Unemployment is at 3.5%, the lowest it's been in 50 years. 5.4 million Americans applied to start small businesses, the highest level ever in American history. And because of the action we've taken, gas prices are declining. We're down $1.25 since the peak at this summer, and they've been falling for the last 3 weeks as well, and adding up real savings for families. Today, the most common price of gas in America is $3.39, down from over $5 when I took office. We need to keep making that progress by having energy companies bring down the cost of a gallon of gas. That reflects the cost they're paying for a barrel of oil. There used to be a direct correlation. Barrel of oil goes down, the price at the pump goes down at the same time. If we're taking average profits they've been making over the last 20 years instead of the historic profits they're making today, the price of gas would be down an additional 40% to 40 cents today to $3 a gallon. And by the way, last quarter, the 5 largest oil companies made, in the last quarter, $70 billion in profit in 90 days. Shell announced just this morning that it made $9.5 billion in profits in the third quarter. $9.5 billion. That's more than twice of what they made in the third quarter of last year. And they raised their dividends as well, so the profits are going back to their shareholders instead of going to the pump and lower the prices. Because if they charge the same amount as they're acting as they did a year ago and 2 years ago, when the price of gas goes down, the price of oil goes down, the price of gas goes down. And even though my Republican friends in Congress seem to be hoping for a recession, many of them, present company excluded, today, the GDP results came out, and the economy, in fact, is growing. In fact, the economy grew at 2.6% rate last quarter, and although it may not feel like it for everyone, people's incomes went up last quarter more than inflation went up.
President Biden today in Syracuse, New York. The White House also putting out a paper on what they call a 5-part plan by congressional Republicans to increase inflation and raise costs on Americans. They said it deals with extending expiring tax cuts for the wealthy, increasing costs of prescription drugs, health insurance, energy, and student loan payments. Congressman Kevin Brady of Texas, the ranking Republican on the Ways and Means Committee, disagreeing with all of that. He was on Fox Business Channel this morning with Stuart Varney talking about inflation and that GDP report, 2.6% economic growth in the third quarter.
People are indeed struggling with inflation, that's for sure.
Yes.
And you say taming inflation is front and center. How exactly are you going to do it?
Yeah, so part of our commitment to America, probably the lead one, is an economy that's strong. And what you'll see House Republicans do is focus on less government spending less taxes and regulation that fuel inflation under President Biden, and more American-made energy, more workers reconnected to their jobs, and more innovation in supply chains that lower inflation. And so you will see basically Republicans take the opposite tack of this president, who today we just saw new reports. The average pay cut for Americans because of Bidenflation is the highest in 25 years. It is a month's worth of their salary. So today they are digging into their savings, skipping meals, delaying retirement. Their nest egg has also gone down by about a quarter. So most Americans know Joe Biden's economy is a very cruel one.
Would you agree with this? No matter what you do, no matter what the administration does, we're going to have at least a 6% consumer price inflation rate for the foreseeable future. Would you agree with that?
I think because of the president's actions and the Federal Reserve, I think that's likely. Unfortunately, we shouldn't be in this. And I think today's economic report points this out. Now, President Biden has missed expectations in 6 out of the 7 economic quarters he's led, even though those numbers have been dumbed down over time. And it's because he drove inflation, this worker shortage so hard, and frankly has no plan to get out of it at all. So I think unfortunately, I think Americans will pay a very steep price for his economic failures.
Congressman Kevin Brady, the ranking Republican on the Ways and Means Committee on Fox Business Channel this morning. He is not seeking re-election, retiring after 13 terms in the U.S. House. Wall Street today, the Dow up 194, NASDAQ down 178, S&P down 23. The Office of Special Counsel in a memo says that President Joe Biden's Chief of Staff, Ron Klain, violated the law by retweeting a political message on his government Twitter account. The law that was violated is the Hatch Act, which Associated Press writes prohibits government officials from using their official roles to influence elections, including supporting candidates while acting in their official capacities. And also this from the AP article, the message Ron Klain retweeted on May 22nd from Strike PAC, a Democratic group, was about delivering infant formula to Americans, but the message also included the encouragement, get your Democrats' delivery merch today. AP White House correspondent Sungmin Kim asking the White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre about it on Air Force One.
Does the White House have a comment on the Office of Special Counsel's finding that Ron Klain violated the Hatch Act?
So Ron is very careful and takes the Hatch Act very seriously in his media appearances and his use of Twitter. But he got it wrong this time, and he retweeted something that was political. He fixed it as soon as it was pointed out, and take the warning to be more careful seriously. That's very different than the prior crew here, clearly at the White House before us previously, that blatantly, openly, and carelessly violated the Hatch Act repeatedly. We are not perfect, but our violations have been few.
Karine Jean-Pierre, the White House press secretary, with reporters on Air Force One. More from the Associated Press article. No disciplinary action will be pursued, and the Office of Special Counsel, an independent government watchdog that monitors violations of the Hatch Act, considers the matter closed. Ron Klain was warned to be more careful in the future. Also, the conservative legal group America First Legal, led by Donald Trump advisor Stephen Miller, complained about the tweet and sought an investigation. That from AP. Washington Today continues in a moment.
Here are a couple of live events C-SPAN Radio has planned for you on Friday at 10 a.m. Eastern, a virtual discussion titled Will Putin's Invasion Go Nuclear?, hosted by the Atlantic Council. Then we head to Georgetown University Law Center for a panel discussion on the arc of reproductive justice post-Dobbs. That begins live at 3 p.m. Eastern. Listen to C-SPAN Radio anywhere on the C-SPAN Now app or on your smart device, say, play C-SPAN Radio.
Welcome back to Washington Today, which you can get as a podcast wherever you get your podcasts and also on the free C-SPAN Now mobile video app. A story from United Press International. Russian President Vladimir Putin said that the world faces the most dangerous decade since the end of World War II as he railed against the United States and its allies in a speech on Thursday. Speaking at the Valdai Discussion Club in Moscow, Russian President Putin blamed the West for creating the crisis in Ukraine and said that Western elites were trying to dominate the world. President Putin also citing NATO expansion as one cause of the war in Ukraine and also referred to the conflict as a special military operation. During his speech, you can find the full video at cspan.org. He said that despite Western fears, Russia does not plan to use nuclear weapons.
We've never said anything proactively about possible use of nuclear weapons by Russia. We have only hinted in response to those statements that the Western leaders have made. Madame Liz Truss, the ex-Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, she said it directly. In her conversation with a representative of the media, she said that the UK is a nuclear power, and the Prime Minister has in his mandate the possible use of nuclear weapons. Well, I'm not quoting her, and she said that she's prepared to do that. And no one responded in any way. Well, she just made a folly. She was a bit out of it. But can you say these things publicly? Well, even if she said it, someone should have corrected that. Washington, for example, could have said that they have nothing to do with that. They don't know anything about it. There shouldn't be any offense made, but just to distinguishing themselves from that. And what we are to think, we think that this is a coherent position, that we have been blackmailed, and what should we do in response? Pretend that we haven't heard anything.
The Russian President Vladimir Putin in Moscow getting questions after giving a speech at a think tank that's closely aligned with the Kremlin. It's called the Valde Discussion Club. Audio and video there from Rupli, Russian state-owned video news agency. At the Pentagon, Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin asked about all this.
Go ahead and start with Associated Press. Tara?
Mr. Secretary, as Russia's invasion of Ukraine continues and it sustains continued conventional losses, are you becoming more concerned that it might be likelier to resort to a tactical nuclear weapon, as Putin has suggested? And secondly, how can the U.S. in kind of this new security construct prevent nuclear conflict from escalating, prevent Russia from using a tactical nuclear weapon, while, as your own strategy said, also possibly deter China from its own nuclear ambitions?
So are we concerned about escalation? We are certainly concerned about escalation. We have been so from the very beginning of this conflict. And that's why we believe that it's important to communicate with our allies and partners, and also with our adversaries. And as long as we have the channels of communication open, and we're able to communicate, what's important to us, then I think we have an opportunity to manage escalation. So that concern's been there from the very beginning, and will remain cited on this going forward.
But does the introduction of potentially using a tactical nuke enter a new era of nuclear deterrence?
Well, I mean, it would be the first time that a nuclear weapon has been used in over 70 years, so that certainly has the potential of changing things in the international community. So this is the thing that I think if this happened, we have been very clear from the very beginning that you would see a very significant response from the international community. So this is important to the world, and again, we remain focused on making sure that we're going to do everything that we can help Ukraine to defend its sovereign territory, and we're going to continue to communicate that any type of use of a weapon of that sort, or even the talk of the use of a weapon of that sort, is dangerous and irresponsible.
U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin at the Pentagon today during a news conference. In his speech in Moscow, President Putin also repeating the claim that Ukraine is preparing to use a radioactive dirty bomb. The U.S. and other Western countries say this could be a false flag for Russia's use of that weapon as well. But President Putin saying today, we don't need this. There is no point, neither political nor military, to use a dirty bomb. More from the Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin's news conference. At the very beginning, he said that the Defense Department is releasing an unclassified version of the National Defense Strategy. He says it lists Russia as a threat, but not as great a threat as China in the long run.
The key theme of the NDS is the need to sustain and strengthen U.S. deterrence with the People's Republic of China as our pacing challenge. As the President's National Security Strategy notes, the PRC is the only competitor out there with both the intent to reshape the international order and increasingly the power to do so. Now, my team and I have been laser focused on this issue since day one, including the China Task Force that I stood up, which produced a range of recommendations to focus the entire department on the China challenge. At the same time, the NDS bluntly describes Russia as an acute threat. And we chose the word acute carefully. Unlike China, Russia can't systemically challenge the United States over the long term. But Russian aggression does pose an immediate and sharp threat to our interests and values. And Putin's reckless war of choice against Ukraine, the worst threat to European security since the end of World War II, has made that very clear for the whole world. Now, the NDS is also clear-eyed about other serious threats, and that includes North Korea's expanding nuclear and missile capabilities. And meanwhile, Iran is moving ahead on its nuclear program, supporting dangerous armed proxies, and even exporting drones that Russia is using to terrorize Ukrainian civilians. And we remain vigilant against the ongoing threat from global terrorist networks, as well as from climate change, pandemics, and other dangers that don't respect borders.
Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, part of his opening statement at today's news conference at the Pentagon. From CNN, U.S. President Joe Biden does not intend to spend time one-on-one with Russian President Vladimir Putin when he attends the G20 in Bali next month. John Kirby, U.S. National Security Council Coordinator for Strategic Communications, telling reporters in an off-camera briefing on Thursday, the president said he has no intention to sit down with Vladimir Putin, and that's where we are today. President Biden previously told CNN's Jake Tapper earlier this month he did not plan to meet with Vladimir Putin, but there was one circumstance under which he would consider it. That reporting from CNN. Much of the pre-Russia invasion of Ukraine predictions about how effective Russian cyber warfare would be have not really come true. There have been cyber attacks, but they've not been as effective as some thought. Today, the White House National Cyber Director Chris Inglis joined Ann Newberg, Deputy National Security Advisor for Cyber and Emerging Technologies, with CSIS Senior Vice President James Lewis to talk about it.
What did you learn from Ukraine? I was talking to an Israeli general who said that Ukraine made him wonder about the utility of tanks. Right? That's interesting from an Israeli. It's emerging technology. It's a different kind of war. Cyber's been a big part of it, if only in the inability of the Russians to execute. What did you learn from Ukraine? What are you going to do differently after Ukraine?
Such a good question. I'd say 3 Ps: preparation, partnership, and private sector. What do I mean by that, right? Ukraine is actually a rallying call for cybersecurity experts who may sometimes say, oh my God, we're on the losing end, to recognize that with the hard work and preparation, one can be in a place that one can defend. Ukraine took a lesson from 2014-15 and the Russians' attacks on their electricity infrastructure. They got hard to work with international partners. The Department of Energy was a key partner along the way, some of the national labs, and worked to secure their grid. They cut their ties to the Russian grid right before the invasion and reconnected and connected to the European grid for resilience. So fundamentally, that preparation and that international partnership put them in a place to defend key components of critical infrastructure. Next, international partnership. Every country was on alert to see where is there destructive use of anything going on in Ukraine, and let's best share that information rapidly, deploy defenses rapidly so we don't have a repeat of NotPetya. And certainly we've seen now, we continue to remain vigilant. So learn from Ukraine, continuously watching. None of us have stopped that. That's a continuous concern of where this may lead. And then finally, private sector partnership. Moving away from cyber for a moment, right? The role of commercial space in providing capabilities that heretofore were national level capabilities is huge opportunity and huge risk for us to think about those kinds of, whether it's surveillance, whether it's communications, in the hands of malicious actors. So how we ensure both we leverage the opportunity and consider the risks. In an area beyond cyber, we're thinking about the advances that have happened in an emerging technology area, like commercial space, is really key. And I'll stop there because I know we're short on time and I want to make sure Chris
So I
has an
certainly agree with
opportunity.
that, and I'll help you on time. I would simply say I would go back to what your Israeli friend tell you and say, I think he's right, but I would generalize the proposition. It's not about tanks. It's not about technology. It's about expertise, as Ann said, and the way we apply that expertise in a collaborative fashion. Right? Expertise actually dominated the battlefield, which is the Ukrainians are really good at cyber defense. It wasn't about their perfect architecture. They don't have a perfect architecture any more than we do. And the collaborative mode between the private sector, the public sectors, plural, actually made a discernible difference, a difference that actually has them prevailing. I think I, in my own case, underestimated the power of defense against a numerically superior offense. An interior defense, meaning when you're back-to-back with a defender and you're actually in a collaboration, actually can hold its own. That might not be an enduring proposition. There could be something that is sufficiently overwhelming that it will prevail. But so far, they've shown us that expertise and collaboration matters.
Chris Inglis is the National Cyber Director, along with Ann Neuberger, Deputy National Security Council Advisor for Cyber and Emerging Technologies. At CSIS, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, moderator James Lewis, the group's Vice President and Strategic Technologies Program Director. Also on the subject of cybersecurity, the Biden administration this week saying it is expanding a voluntary public-private cybersecurity partnership now to include the chemical sector. SecurityWeek.com writes that the ICS Cybersecurity Initiative, that's the Industrial Control Systems Initiative, was first announced in 2021 after the disruptive attack on Colonial Pipeline, and its goal is to improve critical infrastructure security by encouraging and facilitating the deployment of threat detection technologies and systems. Chemical is the fourth sector added to the initiative after electric, pipeline, and water. Thanks for listening to Washington Today. Sign up for C-SPAN's evening newsletter word for word to get the stories Washington is talking about sent to your inbox every day. You can subscribe at c-span.org/connect. Have a good night.